we too rarely have opportunities to sit down with people who disagree with us on these things and hear, in an empathetic manner why they have concerns. Why do some certain people have reservations about red flag laws? Let's find ways of hearing those people out and addressing their concerns, because some of their concerns may be just general distrust of the government doing anything.
You're listening to Talking About Guns, or TAG as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman, and I'm Executive Director of 97%. We're a new bipartisan organization working to reduce gun-related deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate and talk about the hot-button issues, but without the screaming. Later in this episode, Dr. Michael Siegel, a renowned researcher and professor at Tufts University, joins us for another edition of Siegel Scope, where he analyzes the implications of the recent Fifth Circuit decision on gun ownership. But first, my guest today is a self-professed Orthodox liberal sociologist with a concealed carry permit who has published numerous articles, books, and is frequently quoted in the media for his expertise on gun culture. He teaches a course in the Sociology of Guns at Wake Forest University and has multiple social media platforms devoted to Gun Culture 2.0 and to the gun curious. Professor David Yamane, welcome to TAG.
Thank you so much for having me.
Professor, you have a different background than most of the people who are involved in gun issues. You're at Wake Forest. Were you teaching about religion at Wake Forest?
Yeah, the first 20 years of my academic career, I studied the sociology of religion, and then sort of got very tired of that at some point, had a midlife intellectual crisis, and pivoted hard toward guns. That was a little over 10 years ago now.
What made you make that pivot? There are a lot of issues that you could get involved in. Why guns?
Yeah, I grew up in the blue bubble in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I really was completely outside of gun culture, even when I moved to parts of the country that had more guns, like Wisconsin and Indiana. But it wasn't until I got to North Carolina that I started to really notice guns more prominently around me. People that I played tennis with owned guns. My real estate agent owned a gun. I'd see billboards for gun stores and signs on the streets for concealed carry classes. So just really seeing something that was very foreign to me kind of all around me really piqued my interest.
Yeah. So you were in Wisconsin, Indiana, and then North Carolina, came from the Bay Area. And then what's the connection between sociology and guns? Because you also have to convince your school, don't you, that you are going to talk about this issue?
Yeah. So, when I decided that I would start to investigate guns, I had a fairly discrete interest, which was the rise of concealed carry. And so I put together a proposal to study, basically in a normal science kind of way, why people made the choice to get concealed carry permits. And that research was funded. But as I got into it, I saw that it was much more about a discrete choice that individuals were making. I really saw that there was an entire cultural shift toward self-defense in connection with guns, although obviously self-defense has always been a reason for people to own guns, but the entire culture of guns really shifted, and I was right in the middle of that shift happening. So, I kind of pivoted my work toward not just looking at individuals who carried concealed firearms, but the broader self-defense culture of guns that I came to call Gun Culture 2.0.
I would say that would every college say okay to doing this type of class, or are you in a unique situation at Wake Forest?
I think that as long as you have a academic motivation and you ground your work in the existing literature, that you're welcome to teach about and research about what you want. Now, I wouldn't get into such a controversial issue if I was a new faculty member. Mm-hmm. So, I was on my way to being a full professor when I started the project. I had the protection of tenure. So, I think those things made the choice a little bit easier for me. but I don't think that institutionally that there's impediments. Although, I have to say my sociological approach kind of differed from what a lot of what I was seeing in the scholarship, which was really what I would call criminology and epidemiology of gun violence and negative outcomes with guns. So, the path I've tried to carve out really reflected my initial experience of guns, which was, that people who, owned guns and people who used guns were pretty normal.
And so even with your students, I would say at your school, first you have to get students to want to take the class. So that's a big thing. And then in terms of what the students' expectations are, would the students possibly expect what you just mentioned, which is about criminology and guns and that sort of thing, versus the way you talk about guns? Is there a difference of what their expectation is against what they learn in the class?
Yeah, absolutely. And so with this particular class, I have the students, they have to get what we call permission of instructor in order to enroll in the course. And so I lay out in probably an excessively long document the fact that we will cover, gun violence and negative outcomes, but it's not exclusively focused on that. So they're well aware of that going in. And also, one of the unique aspects of the course from the very first time I taught it was that the first thing we do before we even meet as a class is to go to the gun range. And students are not required to shoot, but they are required to attend, to learn about different types of guns, to learn about gun safety, how to use guns. And in the end, most of the students do end up choosing to shoot handguns and usually a rifle. And for many of them, it's their first time ever doing that. And it really sets a nice groundwork for the discussions we'll have in the class going forward.
How many kids every year do you have in this class, would you say?
I teach the course once a year. I get 16 students in the class, and I've taught it 8 times now, and every time there's been a full load of students and some disappointed students who weren't able to get in.
Oh, that's so interesting. And in terms of, is there any comparison between gun culture and religious culture that you found while you're doing this?
I think that for a lot of people, there's a very natural comparison because people, are very strong in their beliefs about religion. They're very strong in their beliefs about guns, that both can be divisive. Both are oftentimes associated with violence, also with virtue. And so, I think that there are some natural connections anytime you're talking about any culture, people's beliefs, values, norms around any activity, whether it's religion or politics or guns. There's some natural similarities there. But I also think that it can be taken too far because we oftentimes on social media and in the regular media see only those people who are most fervent in their beliefs about guns. And, I think the majority of gun owners, care about guns, they're interested in guns, but they don't have a religious zeal toward guns as, we oftentimes see.
So for these students, what do you think surprises them when they go through the class? Because I'm sure they go in with some very preconceived notions. So what do you think surprises them?
Yeah, it's a bit of a simplification, but we really do have different social worlds in the United States around guns. And some people, they're a very normal part of life. And for some people, they only know guns from the negative things that happen with guns. And my students, because, they come from certain backgrounds that, that's why they ended up at Wake Forest for most of them, they are not part of those social worlds of guns where, it's a normal part of everyday life. So their concerns when they take the class really are revolving around, gun violence, especially, this generation of students, really a mass shooting generation. So that's where, their understanding and their concerns come from. So when they come into the class and we spend a lot of time talking about the history of guns, the normality of guns, the extent of gun ownership, I think that is really surprising for them. And even the range experience, is a source of cognitive dissonance for a lot of them because a lot of them enjoy the experience of going to the range and yet have a lot of negative associations with guns. So they have to grapple with that. But that tension, is a great learning tool to build on.
Right. And hasn't, since you've been doing this class, there have been incredibly significant changes in gun culture. The number of people buying guns, who's buying the guns. You just mentioned the proliferation of mass shootings. How is that manifesting itself in your class? It must be, I wonder, for example, is it surprising to your class who's buying the guns?
Yeah, so I definitely have been adding components in the recent years on the changing face of gun owners, especially around pandemic buying and talking about diversity within gun culture overall and gun culture 2.0 in particular. So, I think one of the concept of gun culture 2.0 is really a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, it does capture a reality, but like all concepts, it also simplifies reality. So it's easy for people to think, oh, all defensive gun owners are the same, but clearly not all defensive gun owners are the same. And so, learning about those different faces of gun owners, whether it's liberal gun owners, female gun owners, African-American gun owners, queer gun owners, all of those are faces of gun ownership I try to introduce the students to, either through reading, or oftentimes I'm fortunate to have people come and visit the class who represent those different demographics.
That would be me.
Yeah.
The liberal
Hollywood people.
Yeah. Hollywood people. You're a member of the Liberal Gun Club, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. It's, that's, I did academic paper on that. About 20% of gun owners see themselves as liberal, whatever that means for them in that survey. But, the average gun owner, hides a lot of the diversity underlying gun ownership.
The gun culture's absolutely changed, and something that you talk about, I've heard you talk about, is that the NRA changed. And you talked about, I heard you talking about this, Professor, which was that the good guy, the only thing that could stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with the gun. Can you talk about, I hadn't heard this before until you talked about it, where that phrasing came from, who was responsible, why it came about? I've heard you talk about this, and I didn't know until I heard you talking about this. Do you mind talking about that for a minute?
Yeah, well, this is, I'm sure that there was somebody who actually originated the saying, but, in terms of how that saying got into Wayne LaPierre's mouth, this had to do with Ackerman McQueen, which was their, famous and now separated from advertising agency, who, basically came up with a lot of the ideas and scripted a lot of the work that the NRA did in terms of their public presentation. And, that is also an aspect of why the NRA has sort of fallen apart in recent years, or taken some wrong turns in recent years, is their too close association with Ackerman McQueen. But that, that is part of a public relations advertising agency's campaign to make Wayne LaPierre sound a particular way. I personally, very much dislike that phrase for a number of reasons, but it has a lot of currency and people use it regularly to this day.
So this is like the Frank Luntz thing, with global war, all of his phrases that he used. I didn't know about this advertising agency or this PR agency. So just and you've talked about this, I know too, because I watch your videos. But the NRA started out, and I've read the books about it as well, as a organization to teach people how to shoot, basically post-Civil War. I think, if I remember correctly, Professor, the Europeans were better with a rifle in a lot of ways. And then that was the impetus. I think it started in Greenwich Village, right? The NRA?
Well, it was in New York. It was observed that Southerners were much better shots than Northerners were, but just the general idea that if the United States was going to have a global presence, that it ought to, have people who were skilled marksman. But the thing, the aspect of the NRA narrative that I really resist is the notion that it became political sometime in the 1960s, and that the definitive turning point was 1977. Now, there's some accurate things about that, but if you think about training people to be marksmen so that in case they're soldiers that they can do their job well, that's actually a political act in itself, right? So the NRA has been political from the start, and whenever have been efforts to regulate guns, the NRA has been more politically active. And as the gun control movement became stronger in the 1960s, the NRA put more of its investment into its political work also. I think the accurate part of the kind of shift argument about the NRA is that there was an alignment with political conservatism in the kind of Goldwater form in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And so it's always been political, but the nature of its politics changed. And that was, kind of definitively sealed in that 1977 revolt at Cincinnati, which really is what brought Wayne LaPierre into the picture, along with Ackerman McQueen as their advertising agency. And that really set the future of the NRA as we know it in motion.
Because isn't it true, Professor, that the NRA used to favor some forms of gun reform or gun control, as we would say? And then you're pointing to 1977. I always thought it was more the 1980s. But 1977, when things started to change for the NRA, and they became more of the organization that we know today.
I think that, the NRA, if you look all the way back into, the teens and 20s and 30s, always resisted any regulation that would unduly burden the rights of law-abiding citizens. And so, I think that's been a consistent theme, that anything that imposed that burden on law-abiding gun owners was something that was to be resisted. And I think we still see that aspect today. Now, in terms of regulation of specific firearms and that sort of thing, I think we do see some hardening of the NRA's positions. But, it's also the case that the idea of banning handguns, is something that we saw routinely over the course of the entire 20th century. And it's something that the NRA, as a blanket policy, resisted all along. So, the idea of banning certain rifles, that is relatively new and came about, I think, more once the NRA was already in its very staunch period.
So the idea that people want to ban handguns is not, there are those people, but it's not a possible thing to happen with over 400 million guns in this country. Do you find that you're known as probably the fairest person, I think it sounds like to me, in talking about the gun issue? Do you think that idea, that slippery slope idea on guns, still has a lot of currency with gun owners, that the idea ultimately is to ban guns in this country?
I think it's unfortunate that is out there, because I generally don't believe that it could happen politically. But there are, in the same way that there are, from my cold dead hands, people on the pro-gun side, there are people who really do think that no guns are good guns on the other side. And those people are kind of always lurking around. Now, here's the way I often see the discussion happening these days, which is, we don't want to ban your guns. We don't want to take your guns. And on the other side, it's, but the president just proposed an assault weapons ban. And then so you have to go back and say, asterisk, we don't want to take all of your guns, right? But from the gun owner's perspective, if you want to say we want to ban certain large classes of guns, that makes that slippery slope have some currency. Or people routinely, and I tell my liberal friends all the time, do not invoke England, Australia when you are talking about how to resolve or how to address the issue of mass shootings, because that basically means we are going to ban and confiscate your guns. So, I think a lot of this has to do with, being more thoughtful in discussing these issues across these boundaries.
So I'm glad you brought up that assault weapons mentioned in the State of the Union. If I'm gonna let me digress to that for a moment, because when you hear that and we talk, and obviously the Bruin decision in the Supreme Court and this latest Fifth Circuit decision, we're in a different place than we were on gun issues just a couple of years ago. Things change fast and they've changed again. And the idea that you're going to get that your big thing in the State of the Union is an assault weapons ban, when the Washington Post just recently showed that the majority of Americans do not want an assault weapons ban, which is a change. When Congress is not going to ban assault weapons, and when the courts probably won't allow it, seems to me that there are a lot of other areas you can go in that might be helpful on this issue, and you've chosen to go in one that the people don't want, the courts don't want, and the Congress doesn't want. And I think that that's a mistake. I think the conversation has moved, and I don't think that the administration moved with it. And I was a little disappointed when I heard that.
Well, you know about 20 to 30 times more about politics than I do, but I would say, that has to be, to the extent that it makes sense for him to say that, he's playing to the base of the Democratic Party, right, among which there is a lot of support for assault weapons bans. So, if the 47% of the country supports assault weapons bans. I just made that number up.
You're close. It's 49, so you're very close.
Yeah. So, if it's a slightly less than a majority, if you look at those who are, registered Democrats who vote, it's going to be a majority, I'm sure.
Yes.
And so, but, it's unfortunate that that's the state, that guns have become a political wedge issue in the United States. It makes it extremely hard to take advantage of the commonalities that people have when we talk about guns. I was just in Chicago talking to a group of Lutheran ethicists, and I started by asking, how many people here are in favor of gun violence? And nobody's in favor of gun violence. And so if we start there and then work toward what we can agree on, there's lots of things that can be done short of banning certain rifles that will get us toward that. But again, there's political points to be scored on both sides, by, saying ban this and saying from my cold dead hands.
So I don't like the political aspect of it. Really bothers me, Professor, because I think that there are things that could be done, and then trying to appeal to people by telling them that something could be done that can't be done doesn't move the ball forward. And so I understand catering to your base. Politicians do it. But it does bother me. But let me ask you, and I think you're sort of answering this in your last answer, which is, what is the common ground? How do you've talked about the fact that one side is in one place, one side is in the other place. But the truth is, and we know that, for example, 84% of gun owners favor background checks. We talk about things like that. Red flag law is very much favored by pretty much everybody, maybe 2/3. Favor red flag laws. How do we get this conversation to a point where, as you're saying, people understand that if you own a gun, like you, for example, if you own a gun, you're not a bad person. And if you don't own a gun, you're not a bad person. What do we do about this?
Well, again, beginning with those commonalities, we have to say, where can people agree? People agree that the wrong people should not have access to firearms. And so, it becomes complicated when you try to go from that ideal to policies. But if you relentlessly focus on that and then start moving toward, okay, well, what's a good way to prevent people who shouldn't have firearms from accessing firearms, then we can start making some incremental progress, I think. Something as simple as, hey, how about safe storage? Right now, that's in itself is both an area of commonality, but also an area of difference, because then is it something that's to be regulated, right, by the government, or is it something that's to be educated within the gun owning population? But, I think that if we have those kinds of conversations, we may not end up completely agreeing, but we can see and we can exercise those muscles of empathy and agreement, that don't get exercised often enough, especially around the issue of guns. So
It's so
I'm
yeah.
very much for local, face-to-face conversations about these sorts of things to grow those commonalities.
It's so true because, there was a law that was talked about in Congress called Ethan's Law, which exists in Connecticut. You know about it, which is a gun storage law, right? But it's not passing nationally at this point, but it's been talked about in Congress and has probably majority support or close in the House, probably not right now, but isn't coming up for a vote at this point. Because, and in this case, it's what you said, which is that a lot of gun owners don't favor a law on storage, but there could possibly be a lot of education on storage. When we talk about red flag laws, for example, Florida has had thousands of guns taken away from people temporarily with their red flag law. But in a lot of states, they have red flag laws that they don't even know exist, right? And so they have very little of that, which could also be helpful. So as an example of a place where people agree, probably promoting your red flag laws might be an area where people agree, or possibly keeping guns out of the hands of people who have a violent criminal history.
Yeah.
Is another
Yeah, and
one.
if you ensure, the due process rights, I think that undercuts one of the major objections is that people shouldn't lose their rights sort of a priori. And it's a difficult thing, and this is why we have smarter people than me, writing policies. But again, I think it's one of those situations where we never, or we not never, we too rarely have opportunities to sit down with people who disagree with us on these things and hear, in an empathetic manner why they have concerns. Why do some certain people have reservations about red flag laws? Let's find ways of hearing those people out and addressing their concerns, because some of their concerns may be just general distrust of the government doing anything. And, there are examples historically where, great ideas ended up having negative outcomes. And so that's something to be aware of as well. I think there's reason to hear people's concerns out.
Let me go back because I think the best example of getting people to hear both sides is your class. And it's interesting because I was at your class, and you don't, as people who are not in college, you don't have an opportunity to sit down with a group of smart people, in your case, 16 students plus you, where they're talking about things like mental health issues and guns. Like, those conversations don't exist. So I just want to know if you walk away from that class saying, wow, this is really pretty good. These kids are really involved in learning things about guns and society. Do you ever take a second to give yourself a pat on the back for the work you're doing?
I mean, probably not, but I think that some of this is really structural, and people routinely ask me, especially if I have a guest speaker visiting class like you or a Rob Pincus or Craig Douglas. They're really interested, and they're like, "Oh, are you going to record the session?" And I say, absolutely not, because as soon as there's a recording device in that room, it fundamentally changes the dynamics. That people are not talking to each other anymore. They're talking to some other person that could be listening. And so, this is an experience I've had. Again, I talked to this Lutheran group. I was in Salt Lake City talking to a group of people across views
And now
of guns.
Dr. Michael Siegel
And
for Siegel's
the best
Scope.
conversations I've had about guns are in these settings that are face-to-face, fairly small, and no recording devices present. And, people have to be able to, express vulnerability and say what they're really thinking or express doubt. And if the cameras are running and it's going to end up on cable TV, I guess it's not cable TV anymore, but whatever we have now.
Right.
That people aren't able to have those same kind of conversations. And so my big thing going into 2023 is to figure out how we can have more of those kinds of conversations.
You also do, though, those are the ones that aren't recorded. You also do some recorded educational videos. Can you talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, I have been at this for over a decade now. I started sort of having a public presence through my Gun Culture 2.0 blog, but then I realized at some point that it was really getting, somewhat insider, that it was largely appealing to people already in the gun culture, and I really wanted to reach beyond the gun culture to talk to people who were, either opposed to guns or just curious about guns. So I started a blog called Gun Curious. That was, I put the things that are more sort of, I think, basic educational ideas on there, hoping to reach out to people who are not already committed on the issue. And then, as blog readerships have declined in recent years, sort of across the board, trying to reach, again, beyond the audience of people already convinced, I started a channel I call Light Over Heat.
Right.
My motto, trying to promote light about guns rather than heat around them. And I recorded about 40 or so videos last year that I put out on my YouTube channel, just trying to address, I think issues of common concern about guns. Some is basic data, are my thoughts about gun culture. And that's reached out to some people who wouldn't otherwise read my blog, or certainly people who, most people are not able to take my course.
I watch those videos. They're like 6 or 7 minutes long. Are you reading? Because you are very smooth at this. There are no mistakes. You basically get right through it. How do you do that?
Well, they are edited. I mean, I try to sort of script out what I want to talk about, but then I try to resist the temptation just to read, because, I want people to actually be interested and not be bored by it. It's not, I think, the most natural medium for me, but I do think that there are people who will watch a 5-minute video who won't read a 1,000-word blog post. And so, I'm trying to find ways to just reach as many people as possible with, this message about guns, which, is that we need to be respectful of guns, gun owners, and gun culture. But we can also do that and address the negative outcomes that there are with guns, sort of addressing it at all levels, but particularly within the culture.
Before we go, just what would you say surprises your students the most? Like, I bet a guy like Rob Pincus from ICE Training probably surprises your students when they see that he's like a gun training guy comes in smart, nice guy. I wonder if they're surprised by things like that. What surprises them the most?
Yeah, I think what surprises them the most is the fact that there is a huge range of people who are involved with guns. People, that they're surprised at. And oftentimes, there's an exploration that they go through in their own lives, and they realize, that they may have cousins or aunts or uncles or grandparents. Some of my students even discover that their parents own guns, that they never knew that their parents own guns. And so, really, the diversity of gun ownership and use is something that's fairly eye-opening to them, because honestly, they come from, like, my social background. I did not encounter guns. Even when I was in places where there were a lot of guns, like in Wisconsin and Indiana, my social networks just were so insular that guns were completely foreign to me. So I have my own sort of world of exploration that I've come into, and I try to share that with the students, and that it really hits home with them.
So unfortunately, we can't clone you and have you all around the country, Professor, at all of these colleges. I wish that we could figure out a way to do that, because I think it's such a unique thing. And I'll tell you that even I have a 14-year-old daughter. In school, they're teaching a self-defense class for 2 weeks. And we said to them, why don't you do what you're doing at Wake Forest? And for 2 weeks, talk about gun culture in this country, which is such an important issue, instead of self-defense, which they can go out and do at a karate class any day. So thank you, because I think you're having an influence way beyond what you may even realize. At the end of every episode, we ask our guests to tag somebody else they think would be a good guest for our program. Professor, who would you like to tag?
Well, there's a lot of people I think who are in the non-traditional gun owning world, which I'd like to amplify their voices. But someone who's had a pretty profound intellectual influence on me is actually Randy Mian, who is the executive director of the Liberal Gun Owners. He's a outside the box thinker, and he can tell you all about an idea he has called simultaneous proponency, which is that you can simultaneously defend the right to own guns and also address issues of gun violence. And that's a position that we need more public awareness of.
That's a great one. Okay, thank you. We're gonna do that. Professor, I hope I get to see you in person again soon. Thanks so much for doing this. We appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, I'm ready to head to Hollywood, so just give me a call.
Thanks, Professor. See you soon.
All right, bye.
Thanks. And now for Dr. Siegel with Siegel Scope.
Thanks, Matt, and welcome to another edition of Siegel Scope. In today's edition, what I want to address is a very, very important court decision that was handed down recently by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And basically what the court said was that the federal law that precludes people who are serving under a restraining order for domestic violence from obtaining a gun is unconstitutional. Currently, under a federal law that was enacted in 1994, passed with almost unanimous consent of Congress as part of the Violence Against Women Act, anyone who has been served with a restraining order, a permanent restraining order in a domestic violence situation is not eligible to purchase a gun or possess a gun. This law was challenged because of the recent Supreme Court ruling in Bruin, which changed the goalposts, changed the rules by which these laws are judged as to their constitutionality. And it went to a three-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit, which basically said that back in 1791, in colonial times, there was no precedent for disarming people who had committed domestic violence, and therefore this law can't stand scrutiny under the Bruin decision. The Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, has challenged or has appealed the decision, and so it will most likely go to the full Fifth Circuit panel. If they rule the same way, most likely it will be appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. I want to just first talk about the legal issues involved and then what this means for the policy or the policy platform that we set out, and also what it means in terms of the research that we have done. So from a legal perspective, the question is really whether or not there is a legal precedent historically in colonial times or at least before 1868 for a similar type of restriction. And there's really two ways to look at this. One is kind of a literal way, which is the way the Fifth Circuit looked at it. And they said, well, there was no specific precedent for a law banning gun possession by people who committed domestic violence or who were under domestic violence restraining orders. Well, that's one way to look at it. There's a problem with that, which is that back in colonial times, domestic violence was not viewed as a crime. I mean, basically, it was just viewed as a normal part of a marital relationship. And so it's extremely problematic because if domestic violence wasn't a crime, then how could you possibly have a law that disarms someone for committing what is not a crime? Another way to look at this, which would be consistent, I think, with the Bruin decision, would be to look at it more generally and say, were there laws back in colonial times that restricted gun ownership by people who were viewed as being dangerous under the standards of the time? And the answer to that question is clearly yes. There were many laws that prohibited gun possession by people who were deemed dangerous, especially people who were Black. Numerous states had laws basically saying that if you're Black, you cannot have a gun. because those people were viewed as being more dangerous. And so one way to interpret this is to say it's at the time, if somebody was viewed as being more dangerous, you could pass a law restricting their gun possession. And I think one could make the argument that at today's time, people who have committed domestic violence or who are under restraining orders are viewed as being potentially dangerous. And therefore, one can make the argument that they should not have a gun. And that is perfectly consistent with historical precedent. Which way the courts will decide, we have no idea, and we'll have to see how this plays out. It will probably reach the Supreme Court, and we'll finally get a decision from the court. How literally did they mean what they said in Bruin? But what are the implications of this for public health, for gun violence prevention, for our gun policy platform that we put out there? Well, first of all, this would be devastating for public health. There is strong evidence, including a paper that we published, showing that this specific law that prevents people under restraining orders from possessing a gun actually saves lives. We were able to document a significant decrease in intimate partner homicide in states that have this law in place that was attributable to this law. And so it's very clear that if this law is overturned permanently, it's going to result in an increase in deaths for mostly women in violent domestic relationships. It will have a devastating effect on the public's health. What's even more damaging to public health is that if this decision is upheld, then most other gun laws could potentially be found unconstitutional. Because you could argue, well, was there a law preventing convicted felons from possessing a gun in 1791? And I'm not aware of such a law. Was there a law preventing people who had committed domestic violence? I'm not aware of such a law. Was there a law saying that someone who was not U.S. born could not possess a gun? There was no such law that I'm aware of at that time. And so all of these laws that prevent people who are viewed as dangerous in some way from possessing a gun could potentially be overturned. I view this as an existential threat to the entire realm of gun violence prevention in public health. In our platform, one of the key provisions, the very first one, is what we call the violent misdemeanor law, which means that anyone who has a history of violence, including in the domestic violence setting, and including anyone who's under a restraining order for violence or related to violence, cannot possess a gun. If that part of the platform is struck down, then in essence, the entire platform loses steam, because we have this permit system, but what is it going to check for? If committing a violent crime in the past or being under a restraining order for violent crime is no longer disqualifying for gun possession, then what is? What are you going to be checking for? And so right now, our platform is in jeopardy, depending on what happens with the ultimate ruling that either the full Fifth Circuit makes or that the Supreme Court ultimately makes. And that's why I think this is one of the most important, probably the most important legal case that is out there. There are a lot of cases out there right now challenging various provisions. There are lawsuits challenging assault weapon bans. I don't view those as being the key cases. I think that if that's overturned, as you've heard me say before, I don't think assault weapon bans are effective in the first place, and I don't think we should be pushing for them. So that would not be a tragedy to have those overturned. This particular law would be, because this gets to the basic principle that we found that almost all gun owners agree with, which is that people who have a history of violence should not have access to guns. And so this ruling hurts not only public health, not only non-gun owners, but it hurts gun owners, because it violates the very principle that they believe should be the basis for all gun violence prevention. So a final word, what do I think is going to happen? Obviously, there's no way I can predict what the Supreme Court is going to decide. But what I can say is that if they do rule in favor, if they do uphold the Fifth Circuit's decision, what those justices are basically saying is we really don't care about our legacy. We don't really care about essentially undermining all of gun violence prevention and all of public health. And we will be willing to go down in history as the judges who completely decimated gun violence prevention and public health. It's not clear to me that they want that, that they want to go down that road. In their decision, they were careful to say that, you know, there are some laws that would be upheld, that could be upheld. Judge Scalia, in his decision in Heller, was very clear to try to separate himself out from being someone who wants to decimate all of gun violence prevention. And so I think there's at least a possibility that the Supreme Court, when they look at this, will say, look, the principle stands, you need to have a historical precedent, but you need to have a little bit of judgment when you look at the historical precedent. There needs to be there needs to be some context that's brought to it. And it doesn't have to be a word for word simile to what the current law is. You can look at the general principle of the law. You know, it is trying to prevent people who are dangerous, who are viewed as dangerous at that point in time from having guns, and therefore this law would be upheld. Certainly hope that's the way they rule, because otherwise this is going to have a devastating impact on not just victims of domestic violence, but really all of gun violence prevention and all of public health. Thanks for watching another edition of Siegel Scope, and it's back to you, Matt.
I'm Matthew Littman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and tell your friends about us. You can find more episodes of TAG on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org, and tag who you'd like us to chat with next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.